I thought I knew quiet until he moved in. One room, two lives, and a silence that slowly turned into something we couldn't ignore. This is the story of how stillness became everything. The house had always been silent. Not lonely, not cold, just still. Evan Blake had designed it that way, with long windows that filtered soft light and rooms arranged to catch the quiet like a net holds wind. At 36, he had grown used to the rhythms of silence. The way the floor creaked beneath him in the mornings, the hum of the kettle, the whisper of his own thoughts echoing off clean walls. It was a life built on predictability and structure, by choice, not by accident. When Leo Bennett called, Evan hadn't expected the quiet to change. It started with a message. Leo was the son of an old friend, someone Evan hadn't spoken to much in years. But Leo needed a place to stay for a while, just until he settled in for his studies nearby. He was 23, polite, with a thoughtful tone in his voice when they spoke. Evan said yes without hesitation. He didn't think twice about it at the time. The first day Leo arrived, it felt like a ripple through still water. He moved softly through the rooms, unpacked minimally, asked before touching anything. He was tall, lean, with quiet eyes that watched more than they spoke. Evan noticed the way Leo took in the house, absorbing it like a presence rather than a structure. That first night, he said little. Evan made dinner. They ate in near silence, not awkward but cautious, as if neither of them wanted to disturb the balance. Days passed. Leo woke up early, often before Evan, and made coffee with surprising familiarity. He was studying literature and philosophy, reading late into the night, his door closed but light leaking beneath. The house began to shift. Evan heard the difference in how the rooms breathed. There was a new rhythm to the mornings, a second chair pulled out at the table, the subtle scent of Leo's soap in the hallway after a shower. They didn't talk much. Conversations were brief, but not distant. They shared observations, a headline, a book title, a joke about the weather. And slowly, something began to build beneath the quiet. Not tension, not discomfort, something warmer, a subtle awareness, presence. Evan found himself pausing in the kitchen when Leo entered, feeling the brush of still air when they passed each other in the hallway. They never touched. There was no need. The closeness was in the shared silence, in the nods and faint smiles exchanged without words. In the evenings, Leo would sometimes sit across the room while Evan read or sketched designs. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. There was a night, a Tuesday, Evan remembered when the quiet deepened. Rain pattered against the glass. Evan sat with a cup of tea, staring out into the dark. Leo walked in, barefoot, hair slightly damp from a shower, a book tucked under his arm. He paused, as if unsure whether to speak. Then, without a word, he sat on the floor across from Evan and opened the book. They stayed like that for hours. Evan didn't even realize how much time had passed until the rain stopped and the sky turned to softer black. Leo hadn't said a word. Neither had he. But the space between them had changed. Something had been exchanged, not in sound, but in stillness. The next morning, Evan found a second mug next to the kettle. Leo, already gone for class. A note, scribbled in tidy handwriting, sat beside it. Thanks for the quiet last night. Evan folded the note and tucked it into his drawer. He couldn't quite explain what it meant, but he understood it all the same. In the days that followed, the quiet between them took on new meaning. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it became a language. Leo began leaving small gestures behind. A folded blanket, a rearranged bookshelf, a plate washed before Evan could get to it. And Evan responded without thinking, in the way he adjusted the lighting when Leo read, or left a new book on the table with a subtle note. Thought you might like this. No declarations. No confessions. Just a slow, wordless pull. Evan wasn't sure when the house had started to feel less like his and more like theirs. But one evening, as he passed the hallway and saw Leo sitting on the floor back against the wall, headphones in, eyes closed, something in his chest shifted. The stillness didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt like the beginning of something. And Evan wasn't afraid of the quiet anymore. He was listening. The night had settled deeply around the house, draping every room in a kind of intimate quiet. Evan sat on the edge of his bed, his reading forgotten, eyes wandering toward the door. The stillness was comforting, yet it carried a subtle weight, as if something in the air had changed but hadn't yet announced itself. He heard soft footsteps, measured and hesitant, moving through the hallway like someone navigating their own thoughts. A pause, then the faintest knock on the door, barely audible but deliberate. Evan opened it to find Leo standing there in a worn t-shirt, his eyes shadowed by the dim hallway light. He didn't say anything at first, only shifted his weight from one foot to the other, like he was reconsidering why he had come. But Evan stepped aside without asking questions, giving him space to enter. Leo moved slowly, his presence careful, like he didn't want to take up too much room. Evan returned to the bed, sitting again at the edge, while Leo remained standing a few feet away, his fingers loosely woven together in front of him. There was no urgency in his expression, only an openness, a kind of quiet seeking. Minutes passed without conversation. The silence stretched between them not awkwardly, but with purpose. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, and the faint rustle reached them through the cracked window. Inside, the clock ticked, a reminder of time, steady and indifferent. Eventually, Leo moved to sit on the floor, leaning back against the dresser, his knees drawn up slightly. He rested his head against the wood and looked out the window, eyes flicking toward nothing in particular. Evan watched him from above, noting how calm and yet distant he seemed, as though he were unraveling something internal. There was no need to speak. Whatever brought Leo, there wasn't a question that needed answering. It was a presence that needed witnessing. Evan understood that kind of need. He had lived in it himself for years, the desire to be near someone without expectation, to be seen without the pressure of being fixed. Leo exhaled, the sound quiet but full. Evan matched it without thinking. Their breathing synced in the hush of the room. There was a comfort in knowing that nothing had to be said aloud for it to be real. The moments drifted forward. Evan picked up the book he had abandoned and opened it again, reading a few lines before setting it aside. He wasn't absorbing the words. His focus remained in the stillness, in the shared nearness that somehow spoke louder than conversation ever could. Leo shifted, stretching his legs out and folding his hands behind his head. His eyes eventually met Evan's for the briefest of moments, and in that glance, something soft passed between them. Not a question, not an invitation, just acknowledgement. There was something profound in that exchange, something neither of them tried to name. Evan didn't try to interpret it. He simply accepted it. Eventually, Leo rose, his movements slow, not out of reluctance, but out of care. He gave a faint smile, more in his eyes than on his lips, then turned toward the door. Before he left, he paused, hand on the frame. The silence deepened again, but this time it felt like a word unsaid, a sentence not quite formed. Then he nodded once and stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. Evan sat for a long time after that, listening to the quiet the way one listens to music after it ends, still hearing echoes, still holding on to the rhythm. There had been no revelations, no dramatic moments. Just a night, a space shared, a stillness held between them like a thread. And yet, something had shifted. The house felt different now. Not in its structure, not in its arrangement, but in the way it held their silences, now layered with meaning. Evan lay back on the bed, hands folded behind his head, eyes fixed on the ceiling. His thoughts didn't race. They hovered like dust in sunlight. And among them, the memory of Leo sitting on the floor, quiet, present, unguarded, settled somewhere deep within him. He didn't know what it was becoming, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, familiar, almost comforting. Evan and Leo existed in a shared space where words remained scarce, but awareness pulsed quietly beneath everything. It was in the way Leo paused just a moment longer in doorways, how Evan turned slightly when Leo passed behind him, sensing presence like a change in temperature. Nothing had been said about the night Leo entered Evan's room. There were no callbacks, no conversations, no questions. But the energy between them had shifted in subtle ways. Glances held just a beat longer, silences heavier, as though the space between them had become its own language. Evan began to notice small changes in himself. He lingered longer at breakfast, waiting for Leo to join. He cooked more intentionally, choosing things he thought Leo might like. And in the evenings, he found himself gravitating toward the living room when he knew Leo would be there. Sometimes they sat in the same room, doing separate things, Evan sketching, Leo reading, but always near, always aligned in a way that didn't need explaining. There were times Leo would look up from a book and catch Evan's eyes. He would hold the look for just a second, a softness there, unreadable but certain. Evan never asked what it meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Not yet. One evening, the house was especially still. Outside, dusk painted the windows in shades of lavender and pale blue. Evan was in the kitchen, drying the last of the dishes, when he heard Leo approach. The air shifted. Without a word, Leo stepped into the space beside him, close but not touching. He reached for a glass to put away, brushing Evan's shoulder lightly in the process. The contact was brief, accidental maybe, but it sent a current through Evan's body. Not shock, not fear, just presence. The kind that wakes something dormant. Leo didn't apologize. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It settled around them like a blanket. Later that night, Evan sat by the fireplace with a notebook open on his lap. Leo walked in, hesitated, then sat nearby, not across the room as he usually did, but on the floor just beside the couch where Evan sat. Their shoulders were nearly aligned. Neither spoke. Evan felt the heat from the fireplace and the quiet warmth of Leo's presence next to him. It was enough to be aware of each other, enough to share space without performance. Then came a breath, deep, audible. Leo's shoulders rose and fell. Evan glanced down and caught the way Leo's fingers tightened briefly in his lap before relaxing again. There was something unspoken hovering in the space between them, something not yet ready to be acknowledged aloud. And yet, it was there, undeniable. Leo turned his head slightly, not enough to meet Evan's eyes, but enough to know Evan was looking. His voice came quietly, almost as if afraid to disturb the air. "I like being here." It wasn't a declaration, not even a statement with weight, just an offering. A truth dropped into the stillness. Evan didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was its own answer. Later, after Leo had gone to bed, Evan remained by the fire, his thoughts soft but steady. He replayed the evening in quiet flashes, the nearness, the energy, the way the room had felt full of something invisible but tangible. He still didn't have answers. There were no definitions, no names for what was building between them. But he was beginning to understand that whatever it was, it didn't need explaining. The quiet between them had become something sacred. And Evan wasn't sure when it had happened, but he had stopped wishing it away. He had started waiting for it instead. The weather turned cooler, and with it came an even deeper quiet. The mornings were darker now, and the evenings arrived with a hush that settled over the house like a second layer of insulation. It suited Evan, who had always been most himself in these softer seasons. And yet, the silence now seemed more charged, more alive, as though it waited with him. Leo's presence continued to shape the rhythm of the days. He moved easily through the rooms now, no longer a guest, but not quite a fixture either. Their interactions remained minimal, but filled with texture, subtle changes in breath, the angle of a glance, the weight of a pause. They were navigating something undefined, both aware and unwilling to disturb it with labels. There was a new kind of gravity between them. One evening, Evan came home later than usual, the light already drained from the sky. As he stepped into the house, he felt the warmth of it settle over him like welcome arms. The soft glow of a single lamp lit the corner of the living room, and there, curled up on the end of the sofa, was Leo. He looked up, not startled, but expectant, as though he had been waiting for Evan without knowing it. Evan hung up his coat, moving with deliberate quiet. He didn't speak, and neither did Leo. He simply sat beside him, not close, not far. The room held them both gently. Time passed without markers. The low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional shift of fabric as one of them adjusted. Nothing disrupted the stillness. It felt sacred, almost fragile. Eventually, Leo shifted slightly, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. His voice, when it came, was low and unsure. I think about that night a lot. Evan didn't ask which one. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of it in Leo's tone, in the way his body curled inward slightly, protecting something soft. It's not just that I felt safe, Leo continued. It's that I felt known. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It gave room for the words to settle. Evan turned his head just enough to see Leo's profile, his calm exterior, his inward gaze. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, but it rang clear and deep. This wasn't a confession. It wasn't a request. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly in the language they both understood, gently. Evan reached for a folded blanket on the armrest and passed it to Leo without comment. It was an ordinary gesture, but Leo accepted it with a glance that carried more gratitude than words ever could. He pulled the fabric over himself, resting more comfortably into the cushions. Neither of them said anything more. Later, when the clock marked a quiet hour and the outside world had fully fallen asleep, Leo stirred again. He sat up, his eyes tired but clear. "I don't know what this is," he said, breaking the stillness. "I just know it matters." Evan didn't respond with words. He nodded once, slow and sure, and that was enough. Leo stood, stretching slightly, his movements slow and thoughtful. He looked down at Evan before turning toward the hallway. He paused with his hand on the frame of the doorway. "It's easier to breathe when you're near," he said, barely audible, then stepped away. Evan remained still for a long time after that. He didn't move, didn't shift, just sat in the quiet that had finally learned to speak. The night held him there, and for the first time, the stillness felt not like an absence, but like presence. Full, steady, and deeply, undeniably real. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet between Evan and Leo began to settle into something resembling peace. Not closure, because nothing had ended, but a kind of quiet rhythm neither of them questioned anymore. They no longer tiptoed around the pauses. They welcomed them. The silence had become the backdrop to something steady, something growing. Each morning carried the weight of routine and the lightness of familiarity. 2 coffee cups instead of 1. A second towel always hung beside Evan's. There was a rhythm now to the way they moved through the kitchen, through the hallway, through the day, never needing to narrate, never needing to define. Evan sometimes caught Leo standing by the window, lost in thought, not troubled, but distant, as if holding something tender and unsure. He never interrupted. He knew there were pieces Leo was still gathering, still placing in a quiet order before they could become anything more. And then, one evening, as the sky bruised purple and the streetlights blinked on, Leo appeared in the doorway with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "I was offered a room in student housing," he said. His voice wasn't eager. It wasn't hesitant, just factual. Evan nodded. The air in the room shifted slightly. "Are you going?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Leo looked down, adjusting the strap of his bag, then looked back up with a faint, almost sad smile. "I thought I should, but I keep asking myself why." There was no answer that followed, just the soft ticking of the clock in the background, a rhythm they had both come to rely on. Evan stepped aside, motioning toward the kitchen. "Tea." Leo set the bag down by the door and followed him in. It was an unspoken choice, a pause, not a departure. They sat across from each other as the kettle hissed quietly, the steam curling into the space between them. No one spoke. It wasn't necessary. After a long while, Leo leaned back, his eyes tracing the familiar contours of the room. The warm-toned wood, the small bookshelf Evan kept near the table, the quiet light that always made the house feel like late afternoon. "This feels more like home than anywhere I've ever been," he said softly. Evan didn't answer right away. He reached across the table, letting his hand rest for a moment near Leo's. Not touching, just near. "I feel more myself when you're here," he said at last. The statement was simple, not romantic, not dramatic, just true, and it was enough. They didn't make promises that night. There were no declarations. But the bag by the door remained untouched, and the second cup of tea went cold between them as they sat in the presence of something that needed no clarification. In the days that followed, nothing much changed, and yet everything did. Leo stayed, not as a guest, not as someone with an end date. He simply stayed, and Evan never asked how long. He didn't need to. There were still quiet evenings, still long silences, but they were filled now with shared looks, with unspoken understanding, with the comfort of two people who had found in each other the one thing that made the rest of the world feel less uncertain. One night, much later, they sat together on the porch as rain began to fall. The sound was steady and soft, a familiar kind of hush. Leo leaned slightly against Evan's shoulder, and neither of them moved. It wasn't about what would happen next. It was about the quiet they had built, and how, somewhere in the middle of it, they had found something neither of them had expected, a place that finally felt like home.